This video will explain the push and pull factors that have influenced successive waves of post-war migration. Push factors are conditions that drive the movement of people away from their homes. Push factors have driven people from their homelands for centuries. High unemployment, for example, drove poor British citizens from rural areas to the cities during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Push factors such as unemployment, homelessness, displacement, inflation, and political and economic instability also affected the post-war environment in Europe. Pull factors are conditions that attract the movement of people to a place. Pull factors can include employment prospects, political and economic stability, freedom from oppression, opportunities to start a new life, higher relative standards of living, a better lifestyle, and a more favourable climate. These pull factors attracted immigrants from post-war Europe to Australia. Australia is often described as a settlement country, which means that it has received high numbers of migrants over the years. Australia has experienced successive waves of immigration since World War II. Each wave has been characterised by migration from a particular region and has usually been related to world events such as wars and the changing immigration policies of the Australian government. Let's look at each wave and the push and pull factors that influenced each. When World War II officially ended in 1945, Europe was left a war-ravaged continent. The continent became divided between the democratic capitalist states of the Western Bloc, represented here in blue, which supported the United States and their allies, and the communist authoritarian states of the Eastern Bloc, states represented here in red, which were under the control of, or allied to, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. Most European industry had been destroyed as a consequence of the war, when production was diverted to the war effort. Many countries were bankrupt and, in 1947, the United States instigated the Marshall Plan to provide economic aid to their former allies. This plan was a long-term, large-scale rescue plan that took European nations 60 years to pay back. This was the political and economic environment that European citizens found themselves post-war. In addition to these push factors, more than 2 million migrants were attracted to Australia's shores in the 20 years after the war by the government's populate or perish immigration policy. British migrants were granted assisted passage under the £10 POM scheme from 1945 to 1972, and 170,000 people who had been displaced from their homes during the war were assisted to come to Australia from Greece, Italy, the Baltic states and Malta. By 1949, Australia accepted any European immigrant provided they were under 45 years of age and not communist. Thousands of British and European migrants were attracted to Australia in the 1950s and 60s by the promise of employment and a better quality of life. Many of these were recruited to work on large developments such as the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. The 1970s marked a significant change in Australia's migration patterns when, during the 10-year period after the Vietnam War ended in 1975, over 80,000 Indo-Chinese refugees arrived in Australia. Known as boat people, these refugee migrants had fled their homes in Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos by boat, looking for the safety in neighbouring countries. Push factors were the main reasons for these migrants leaving their home countries. Most were fleeing the effects of war from the fear of persecution for their opposition to communist rule. Crucially, Australia had signed a United Nations agreement to accept refugees in 1954, and it was obliged under the agreement to resettle significant numbers of Indo-Chinese refugees after the war. A major change in government policy occurred in 1973 when the White Australia policy, which had favoured migrants from Britain and Europe, was dismantled in favour of a multicultural immigration policy. It was not until 1975, however, when the Racial Discrimination Act 1975 was introduced, that it became illegal to use race as a factor for making judgments about entry to Australia. Since that time, immigration decisions have been made based on a migrant's work skills or business and investment links that can benefit Australia regardless of their country of birth or ethnic background. Australia's multicultural immigration policy since the 1970s has been a major pull factor for migrants from around the world. As well as changes made to attract skilled migrants, successive waves of migrants have been accepted for entry to Australia since the 1980s in response to world events. Australia has expanded its annual intake of migrants on humanitarian grounds as a result of conflicts in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. In Sudan, for example, an ongoing civil war caused thousands of people to flee their homes to refugee camps in neighbouring countries as rebels destroyed entire villages and threatened lives. In response, Australia increased its humanitarian intake of Sudanese refugees, accepting over 20,000 between 1996 and 2006. As well as these changing government policies, improved economic conditions in Europe have altered the dominant source of countries of Australia's migrants. Whereas once Italians and Greeks made up the majority of non-British new arrivals, today Australia's migrants originate from more than 185 countries, with New Zealand, China, India and the Philippines contributing to the highest number of migrants. Australia has had a checkered migration history, but with the relaxation of government policy and the consistent lure of lifestyle factors, overseas migration has been the main driver of Australia's population growth for the last decade.